Welcome to the deep dive. So if you picture the Korean conflict today, what comes to mind? For most people, it's the DMZ.
Right, that static frozen line.
Exactly. It feels like a line was drawn back in 1953 and it refuses to budge. You imagine these two massive armies just locked in a quiet, endless stasis.
And, that view is not just incomplete, it's dangerously misleading.
How so?
Because for decades, the area of operations, both along and behind that invisible line, was anything but quiet. It was a turbulent, terrifying shadow war.
A shadow war.
Absolutely. Covert operations, deep infiltrations, state-sanctioned terror,
Yeah.
assassination plots that were running red hot just beneath the surface of what seemed like official, détente. The conflict didn't stop. It metastasized.
And today, we're going deep into what might be the most tragic, the most cynical, and ultimately the most self-destructive example of that shadow conflict. We're talking about the story of Unit 684.
This was a South Korean commando unit. It was created with one single, explicitly suicidal mission.
To assassinate North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung, in Pyongyang.
Right in his own palace. They were forged as a black op, a pure instrument of national vengeance.
But here's the profound paradox of this story, and it's the reason it has just completely captured the South Korean imagination for decades.
They never completed their mission.
They never even went north. Instead, in August of 1971, these highly trained operatives, the state's own weapon, they turned their guns on the state itself.
Which led to this violent, final confrontation that ended. I mean, you couldn't write this in a spectacular bus explosion right in the heart of Seoul.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really reconstruct that timeline. We're using declassified military records, we have forensic data, and maybe most importantly, the findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
And we're looking beyond just a simple failure of command. We really want you to understand the structural, the political, and the psychological forces that made this disaster almost inevitable.
How things like sweeping geopolitical shifts, the state's desperate need for plausible deniability,
And the cynical use of what they saw as disposable citizens.
all of that combined to compel these men to aim their final devastating act directly at the Blue House.
So what transformed them? What turns elite special operators, men willing to die for their country, into mutineers? We have to understand why they saw their own government, not the enemy in Pyongyang, as the immediate architect of their suffering.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start where it all began, the crucible of 1968. To understand Unit 684, you absolutely have to understand the year 1968 in Asia. In the West, we often focus on the global upheaval,
Right, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the Prague Spring.
student protests in Paris, all of that. But in Korea, 1968 was a year of immediate existential crisis. It was something else entirely.
Precisely. In Korea, 1968 wasn't about philosophical debates, wasn't student protests. It was defined by the terrifying, very real proximity of all-out war.
The armistice of 53 had ended open combat, but it didn't end the conflict.
Not at all. By the late 60s, it had morphed into this systematic campaign of infiltration from the North. North Korea's strategy was essentially to destabilize the South through acts of terror and these high-profile assassinations.
And the climax of this shadow war, the single event that shattered the national psyche and directly triggered the creation of Unit 684, it happened on January 21st, 1968, the infamous Blue House raid.
That day, it really stands as one of the most brazen acts of aggression in post-armistice history. On January 17th, so a few days earlier, a 31-man commando team from North Korea's Specialized Unit 124. They had successfully breached the DMZ.
And the sources are clear on this, right? These were not just regular soldiers.
Oh, absolutely not. These were apex special operators, selected for their physical fanaticism, their political dedication, their resilience. They had gone through 2 full years of brutal, singular preparation.
And that entire preparation was focused on one specific target.
One target: the South Korean presidential residence, the Blue House. They actually trained on a full-scale architectural mock-up of it. They rehearsed every possible approach, every security weakness, every line of retreat.
So this was a pure decapitation mission.
A decapitation mission, plain and simple, aimed at finding and eliminating President Park Chung-hee.
The tactical audacity is it's unbelievable.
It is. To get that deep, they were disguised meticulously. They wore the standard Republic of Korea Army, or RAA, uniforms. They even had the insignia of the local 26th Infantry Division on.
So they looked just like a South Korean patrol.
Exactly. And their weapons, we're talking Type 63 submachine guns, stick grenades, they were all concealed under trench coats. They marched boldly, posing as a counter-infiltration patrol, and they managed to bypass multiple critical checkpoints along the way.
They got terrifyingly close, didn't they? How far did they actually penetrate before they were stopped?
They made it to within 100 meters of the Blue House itself.
100 meters.
Right near an area called 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 Gate, which is basically the final hill leading into the complex. Their cover was only blown when a local police chief, a man named 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, just got suspicious.
What tipped him off?
He noticed their identical gear, their rigid posture, and just their odd responses to his questions. It didn't feel right. That brief confrontation led to an exchange of fire, and that's what kicked off the chaos.
And once the first shot was fired, the capital city, Seoul, it just instantly became a war zone.
It did. The commandos immediately reverted to their training. They were using automatic fire, tossing grenades. The manhunt that followed was massive. It lasted for days across the mountains north of the city. But even though the assassination failed, the very fact that an enemy force had reached the presidential residence was a national humiliation. It exposed a fatal strategic vulnerability.
And the final tally of that raid, it really underscores their training, their fanaticism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Of the 31 infiltrators, 29 were killed in firefights, or they committed suicide. They would bite down on cyanide capsules or pull the pins on their own grenades to avoid being captured.
And 2 got away.
One, a man named Pak Jae-gong, managed to escape all the way back to the north, which is an incredible feat in itself.
And the other one?
The other one, Kim Shin-jo, was captured alive.
And his interrogation was a key moment.
It delivered a profound, visceral trauma to the South Korean state because they broadcast it nationally. And we have that famous chilling quote that just defined the moment. He said, "I came to slit the throat of Park Chung-hee."
Chilling. The enemy hadn't just attacked the capital. They had aimed directly at the head of state, and they had nearly pulled it off.
And you have to remember, as we mentioned, this didn't happen in a vacuum. The internal trauma was magnified by what was happening geopolitically right at that moment.
That context is everything.
It is. Just 48 hours later, on January 23rd, North Korea seized the USS Pueblo. This was a highly sensitive U.S. intelligence gathering ship captured in international waters. A massive public humiliation for the United States.
And the U.S. was already completely stretched thin.
Absolutely. The Tet Offensive was underway in Vietnam. It was stretching American military resources and political will to the absolute breaking point.
So Washington was terrified.
They immediately feared the North Koreans were trying to open a second front to draw U.S. resources away from Vietnam. And the U.S. reaction was instant and it was firm. They put extreme pressure on Seoul. They essentially became the restraining hand.
So President Park was told, in no uncertain terms,
do not retaliate. Do not launch an overt military strike that could risk escalating this into a full-scale war.
So Park is in this impossible bind. His regime's legitimacy demands a response, a proportional response to this profound humiliation. But his main ally has his hands tied.
He had to respond. It had to be decisive, but it had to be covert. He needed a form of vengeance that was both symmetrical and completely deniable.
And since he couldn't just send the regular army to strike Pyongyang,
the solution became a covert, a black operation. The directive came down from the Blue House. It was channeled to the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the KCIA, and then given to the ROK Air Force to organize this highly specialized mission.
And the specific mandate?
The mandate was simple, almost poetic in a dark way.
Okay.
Create a unit to execute the exact same mission Unit 124 had just attempted. The physical elimination of Kim Il-sung. Balance the scales.
This is where that symbolic symmetry becomes so sharp.
Acute. The unit size was specified at precisely 31 men.
31.
A numerological mirror. A tit-for-tat revenge measure. It was designed to demonstrate that the South Korean state could play the exact same ruthless game, person for person.
It's almost like spiritual warfare.
It was symbolic statecraft disguised as military strategy. The unit was officially designated the 209th Detachment of the 2325th Group, but it became known by its formation date, April 1968. And so, born from national trauma and Cold War politics, Unit 684 came into being.
So, decades later, when this story finally starts to leak out, largely because of the incredible popularity of that 2003 film, Silmido, the public narrative gets cemented.
Right.
These men were death row inmates, hardened criminals, a kind of South Korean dirty dozen, offered freedom in exchange for one last suicide mission. It's a great dramatic premise.
It's a very compelling drama, but it fundamentally misrepresents the true nature of this tragedy.
The official investigation found something different.
Very different. The findings of the 2006 Truth and Reconciliation Commission definitively debunked that death row mythology. So while the mission was, without a doubt, a suicide assignment, the recruits were overwhelmingly not condemned killers facing immediate execution.
And that distinction is crucial, because if they weren't being forced by the threat of the gallows, then who were they? What kind of young men did the KCIA and the 𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐂 look for to fill this highly sensitive top-secret operation?
The sociological profile that the commission provided is, it's pretty sobering. The state didn't seek out professional military men or convicted murderers. They sought, and this is the term they used, social outcasts.
So they were casting their net along the margins of society.
Exactly. The sources talk about petty criminals, street thugs, drifters, and desperately unemployed youths.
Which speaks directly to the economic landscape of South Korea at that time.
Absolutely. This was the peak of the Miracle on the Han River. South Korea was industrializing at this breakneck pace. It was creating immense wealth, but it was also creating immense stratification.
And these recruits were the young men who were left behind by that miracle.
Yes. They lacked the education, the family connections, the social capital to succeed in this new, rapidly developing economy.
So rather than being these irredeemable killers from the movies, they were the socially forgotten, the economically desperate.
Precisely. We have survivor testimony from the training cadre, and it paints a picture of men who were rough. Yes, they were prone to street fights, but they were essentially the flotsam of a rapidly modernizing society.
Like who?
Shoeshine boys, delivery workers, market bouncers, men who just struggled to hold down a job. They were desperate young men looking for a way out of poverty. Any way out.
So if desperation was the motivator, what was the state offering them in exchange for what was their likely death?
The lure was both economic and social. They were offered substantial financial rewards, large sums of money that were promised to their families. But the critical element, the real hook, was the promise of social rehabilitation.
What did that mean specifically?
They were explicitly told they would receive guaranteed government employment and Social Security once they successfully completed the mission. They were promised honor and integration into the very society that had previously rejected them.
So they saw this as a contract, a transactional contract. We give you our lives, you give us a future and status.
And this is the core of the tragedy. Because they were civilians entering a deal, a contract for status and money, the eventual betrayal felt so much more profound than if they had been convicts whose lives were already forfeited. The state had promised them not just payment, but recognition, a place in the world.
This whole selection process, then, it reveals the cold, cynical calculus of the Park Chung-hee regime. They were specifically choosing men who were, for all intents and purposes, disposable biological assets.
That is the necessary conclusion you have to draw from the evidence. They were chosen because their lack of powerful connections or social standing ensured the critical element of the entire operation.
Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
How is that actually implemented on a bureaucratic level?
Ruthlessly and efficiently. There were no official enlistment papers. Nothing that linked them to the ROK Air Force in a standard, traceable way. This absence of a paper trail was completely intentional.
So if the mission succeeded,
they'd be quietly reintegrated, paid off, given jobs. But if they failed, if they were killed in Pyongyang, the government could issue a flat denial.
And just claim they were, what?
They would claim these men were rogue criminal elements, or maybe even North Korean dissidents who had gone rogue. It would insulate the Blue House from any international scrutiny and allow them to point the finger right back at the North.
So the very act of recruitment, it wasn't just mobilization. It was a deliberate act of bureaucratic erasure from the start.
It was an act of profound social betrayal from day one. The tragedy didn't begin with the brutal training. It began with the selection. The state was harvesting its undesirables, weaponizing them into a suicide squad, and planning their expendability to serve a political objective. It was a cynical act of social cleansing, masked as patriotic duty.
Okay, so with this unit now formed from these men lacking any real social capital, the next stage was their conditioning. And for 3 long years, the entire world of Unit 684 was reduced to a single, small, desolate island off the coast of Incheon, 𝐃𝐿.
And 𝐃𝐿 was chosen for a reason. It was uninhabited, geographically isolating.
So perfect for a black site.
Perfect. While it was close enough to the mainland for, necessary logistical supply runs, it was separated by these treacherous tidal flats and really strong currents. It made unauthorized access or escape virtually impossible.
So for 3 years, they were non-persons, ghosts existing only for a single delayed mission.
That's right.
And the outline suggests the training wasn't just to prepare them, it was designed to strip away their humanity and forge them into purely lethal instruments. What did that training actually look like?
It was beyond grueling. They went through this comprehensive special operations training designed to surpass the capabilities of the North Korean Unit 124.
So things like
Advanced mountain infiltration, deep-sea survival training in freezing water, comprehensive taekwondo and weaponless combat, specialized knife fighting, handling of various explosives. They were meant to be silent, invisible, and utterly lethal.
But the motivation here wasn't some kind of patriotic esprit de corps. It was terror.
That's correct. The commanding officers themselves, they were under immense constant pressure from the KCIA and the Blue House to produce results. And that pressure was transmitted directly to the recruits through unrelenting systemic violence and psychological abuse. The sources confirm this crossed the line from rigorous military discipline into systematic torture.
It was designed to break them.
Mentally and physically.
I remember reading a detail about live rounds being used for discipline. That's just a staggering deviation from any kind of standard military procedure.
It's the point of no return, really. The reports confirm that live rounds were used to discipline troops so that death would become a huge motivational force. This wasn't accidental firing. This was controlled, lethal intimidation.
So the trainers were openly using the threat of death.
Or actual execution to enforce obedience. The recruits were forced to internalize the fact that their lives were forfeit, not just to the enemy in Pyongyang, but to their own commanders. It established this fatal dynamic of absolute power and fear.
And the sheer brutality of this regime is reflected in the death statistics, right? This is before the unit even deployed. 7 of the original 31 recruits died during those 3 years of training.
And these weren't training accidents.
No, they were systemic executions.
They were, by and large, summary executions intended to establish absolute control and terror. We know that one recruit, he succumbed to extreme exhaustion and hypothermia during that grueling sea survival training. And the lack of proper medical attention was also deliberate. Their lives were just deemed expendable.
And the rest of them, they died either trying to escape or for insubordination.
Exactly. 2 men were executed for attempting desertion, likely killed right in front of the remaining unit members as a chilling, definitive example of the penalty for trying to break their contract.
And another one.
Another was executed for threatening a trainer, an act of insubordination that was met with immediate lethal force to reinforce that hierarchy of terror.
There was also that tragic incident involving the 3 who managed a brief escape.
Yes. That was perhaps the most desperate act. These 3 recruits, they actually managed to escape Sulmito. They reached a neighboring island, and in this mixture of desperation and violent rage, they assaulted a civilian woman.
What happened to them?
They were either killed during recapture by the pursuing ROCAF forces, or they were executed immediately upon their return to the isolation of Sulmito. In all 7 cases, the message was crystal clear. Your life is owned by the state, and we can take it from you at any moment.
The psychological outcome of that must have been absolute terror, and it must have established this deep, simmering rage directed at their own command structure. They had essentially been fighting a war against their own trainers for 3 years.
And you have to compound that physical abuse with the psychological torture of total isolation. They had 0 contact with their families, 0 news, the shifting world outside, 0 respite. They were non-persons. And then came the ultimate crushing betrayal.
The logistical abandonment.
Yeah.
You mentioned this turning point around 1970, 1971. The support it dried up.
It did. The 2006 Truth Commission report detailed how, after that first year, salary payments, the very foundation of their transactional contract, were systematically halted. And at the same time, the quality and quantity of food and supplies just plummeted.
So they weren't just being trained anymore. They were being starved.
They transitioned then from being these elite, highly funded assets to forgotten, unpaid prisoners who were basically left to rot on a rock.
And that change in status must have been devastating.
They saw themselves as soldiers who had upheld their end of the contract, their willingness to die, only to have the state just unilaterally void its side of the deal, the honor, the money, and even the food. This betrayal of the most basic compact, food for service, was the catalyst that transformed their fear into justifiable rage. They were no longer just expendable, they were utterly abandoned.
So that abandonment on Sulmito provided the fuel, but it was the shifting geopolitical winds that provided the spark. Unit 684 was born in 1968, a year of peak confrontation. But by 1971, the world had fundamentally shifted.
It had. The era of détente had arrived, and it rendered the entire mission, the entire reason for their existence, completely obsolete.
And this shift was unstoppable. It really began with the Nixon Doctrine in July of 1969.
Right. The U.S. declared it would increasingly look to its Asian allies to take primary responsibility for their own defense. It signaled a decisive long-term reduction in direct American engagement on the ground in Asia.
For South Korea, this meant losing the security blanket that had defined the past 2 decades.
Precisely. The doctrine led directly to the 1971 withdrawal of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division.
That's a massive number of troops.
It's 20,000 troops, and Park Chung-hee understood this as a mandate from the U.S. to de-escalate. The aggressive, confrontational posture that made an assassination squad seem like a good idea in 1968 was now a strategic liability. Park was forced to seek normalization and stability to compensate for that reduction in U.S. military backing.
And the final decisive blow. It came in August 1971, the very month the mutiny occurred.
That month marked the definitive end of confrontation. On August 12, 1971, South Korea proposed formal, high-level talks with the North Korean Red Cross to discuss the highly sensitive issue of reuniting separated families.
This was historic.
It was the first major diplomatic engagement between the two Koreas since the armistice.
Which makes the Unit 684 mission catastrophically impossible at that point?
It's completely non-negotiable. I mean, just imagine the diplomatic fallout. If a covert assassination squad targeting Kim Il-sung had been deployed right then, it would have instantly scuttled the fragile peace talks. It would have embarrassed the United States, who is pursuing its own engagement with China and the USSR. And it risked triggering the full-scale war that South Korea, now with less U.S. support, could no longer afford to fight.
So the mission was canceled.
It simply evaporated into the political ether.
Which means the government now faced this massive, dangerous administrative dilemma. They couldn't use the unit, but they couldn't release them either.
The risk of release was just too high. Releasing 24 highly trained, traumatized, and unpaid men would require the state to publicly acknowledge the entire plot. They'd have to pay their substantial, accumulated wages. And they'd risk them revealing the secret operation to the world.
The international scandal and the domestic outrage would have crippled the Park regime.
So they chose administrative limbo, abandonment on Silmido. But the abandonment itself, that created the lethal rumor.
Right.
When the supplies and the pay vanished completely and the mission never materialized, the recruits developed this terrifying but very logical conclusion.
That they were now liabilities the state needed to erase.
Exactly. They began circulating rumors that the government had issued a quiet order to liquidate the entire unit, just to clean up the operational paper trail and bury the secret forever.
And even if the trainers later denied that a formal kill order was ever issued, the recruits' perception of that threat was absolutely real to them.
The logic of the cover-up was undeniable to men who had already watched 7 of their own comrades be executed by their own officers. Their deaths were the state's most expedient solution to a political problem. And this belief, this conviction that they were about to be killed by their own side, it transformed the abandonment into an existential threat. The mutiny became a preemptive strike, a fight for survival against a state that had utterly betrayed its foundational compact.
So the tension, which had been fueled by 3 years of isolation and this existential fear of imminent execution, it just snapped spectacularly. On the morning of August 23, 1971, what was the final, immediate trigger for the violence?
Accounts suggest it involved a supply of alcohol. The cadre, the trainers, may have been consuming it, maybe relaxing their guard after realizing the mission was canceled, or the desperate trainees managed to steal it from the supply stores.
But either way.
Regardless, the presence of alcohol, combined with the trauma and the fear of liquidation, it just catalyzed the revolt.
And when they moved, they didn't move like criminals. They moved with the precision and the lethality that the state had paid for 3 years to instill in them.
They executed the mutiny with brutal efficiency. They struck the command center around 6:08 a.m. while the cadre was vulnerable. Their first victim was the captain.
And he wasn't killed with a bullet?
No, he was killed with a hammer. An intimate, visceral act of vengeance that just speaks volumes about the deep, personal rage they felt toward their immediate betrayers. After that, they seized all the weapons, securing absolute control of the island.
The sources confirm the violence was comprehensive. Of the 24 trainers on Silmido, 18 were killed.
The unit was perfectly functional. The weapon the state had forged was working with ruthless effectiveness. But the coordinates of its ultimate target had disastrously reversed. It had turned on its maker.
With the island secured, the 24 surviving mutineers, and we should remember they are the survivors of the original 31, they commandeered a boat and made landfall near the Incheon coast.
They were armed, they were rogue, and they had no political support structure. Just a burning destination. Seoul.
They hijacked a passenger bus and began the drive toward the capital. And this takes us back to the central mystery we set out to solve. Why the Blue House? Why not head north to the DMZ and try to defect? Why turn their final, desperate act on the capital city of the state they were supposedly serving?
Because this wasn't a simple criminal rampage, and it wasn't a defection. This was a profoundly symbolic, political, and psychological act, and it was driven by something deeper than fear. It was driven by what we now understand as moral injury.
Let's define that. What is moral injury in the context of these men?
Moral injury describes the severe psychological, spiritual, and social distress that results when a soldier or combatant commits, or, and this is the critical part here, is subjected to actions that violate their deeply held moral or ethical codes.
So for the men of Unit 684, the moral compact of military service was violated when the state symbolized by President Park, the ultimate paternal figure in that culture, broke its promise.
They were starved, beaten, their pay was withheld, and then they were threatened with death, all while they were upholding their end of the bargain. They weren't just fired, they were orphaned and then marked for death by their own family.
They had been asked to be the ultimate patriots, to be willing to strike the ultimate blow against the nation's enemy. And when the father, the state, betrayed them, they lost their entire sense of purpose and belonging.
They became ghosts, and they were demanding recognition.
The drive to the Blue House was a demand to be seen. They'd been erased from the paper trail, treated as disposable. They were forcing the state to acknowledge their existence by bringing the war they were trained for directly to the president's doorstep. It was the only way they knew how to ask, "Why did you do this to us?"
It was the Disposable Tools Rebellion. They were weaponized and then abandoned. And when the owner threatened to liquidate the tool, the only recourse left was to turn against the hand that wielded it. They knew they were going to die. This was their final, self-directed suicide mission.
And they chose to die making a statement against the hypocrisy of the South Korean state, rather than dying silently in obscurity on a forgotten rock for an abandoned cause. They were making sure their names would be remembered, even if only as mutineers. So as this hijacked bus carrying the mutineers is barreling towards Seoul, it's exchanging fire with desperately mobilized police and military units. They're trying to stop them before they reach the core government district.
And the government's immediate panicked reflex in the face of this internal rebellion it's highly revealing.
What did they do?
They immediately reported to the press that armed communist agents had infiltrated Seoul. They automatically externalized the violence, framing it as yet another North Korean plot.
So even as their own secret creation was bearing down on the capital, they were still trying to maintain that lie of plausible deniability.
To the very end, the chase finally culminated in the Dibangdong area of Yeongdeungpo in Seoul. The bus was eventually immobilized, its tires were shot out, and it crashed near the end of the road.
At which point, the mutineers were surrounded. Overwhelming military and police forces.
At that point, they understood escape was impossible. And crucially, they also understood that surrender meant certain liquidation, either through a staged incident or a secret execution. It confirmed the very rumors they had feared for months back on Solmito.
So they made the final, terrifying decision to control their own deaths.
And that decision led to that horrific finale inside the cramped confines of the hijacked bus. The grenade suicide.
They pulled the pins.
The men pulled the pins on their hand grenades simultaneously. The confined space just amplified the destructive force. Forensic analysis later detailed massive barotrauma and fragmentation injuries. The scene was utterly devastating. It killed most of the mutineers instantly. Of the 24 who had escaped Solmito, 20 died either in the surrounding firefight or in that final blast.
But 4 wounded members survived. They were captured.
They were immediately taken into custody and, critically, treated by the state not as abandoned soldiers with a grievance, but as common traitors and existential liabilities.
They were subjected to a swift and secret military tribunal.
The entire process was closed to the public. The records were sealed. The government needed to bury the details as quickly and as quietly as possible. In March of 1972, all 4 were sentenced to death.
And yet, despite the state's calculated efforts at erasure, something truly profound survived that destruction.
It did. a 10-page handwritten testimony. It was discovered decades later, in 2005, found among fragmented military records.
And this document, it really is the emotional heart of the entire tragedy.
It is. In their final thoughts, written just before their execution, these men didn't express hatred for the South Korean people or even for the regime. They wrote, instead of profound chagrin, this bitter disappointment that they would die without fulfilling their original mission, to blow up Kim Il-sung's palace.
One of them wrote something simpler.
Yeah, one of them wrote, simply and powerfully, "I miss my family so much."
It just shows that even after being betrayed, abused, labeled traitors, they still maintained their self-identity as patriots. They were defined by the singular mission that the state had denied them.
They were ready to die, but they wanted to die for the right cause, not at the hand of their own government.
On March 10th, 1972, the 4 survivors were executed by firing squad.
And the final act of erasure was meticulous. Their bodies were buried in secret, unmarked graves in a place called Goyang. Their families were not notified of their fate for decades. Many of those families continued to believe their sons were still operating overseas on some top-secret mission, maintaining the lie this state had created from the very beginning.
So for nearly 30 years after 1971, the story of Unit 684 was completely suppressed. It was a state secret. The military methodically destroyed all the documents, and the official narrative, if they were ever forced to acknowledge the incident at all,
was that it is nothing more than a disturbance by unruly common criminals.
The state did everything in its power to ensure these men just disappeared from history. They were successfully made into ghosts.
But the silence was finally broken, and not by an official inquiry, but by popular culture.
In 2003, the film 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 was released, and it became this colossal cultural phenomenon in South Korea. It drew over 10 million viewers, which was a massive figure at the time.
While the film relied heavily on that death row myth for drama, its existence forced the entire South Korean public to confront this uncomfortable, horrific reality that their own government had created, abused, and ultimately destroyed a suicide squad composed of its own citizens.
That cultural recognition created the necessity for official truth.
It did. In 2005, the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission marked the beginning of a true investigation. And the 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 incident was immediately made a priority case.
And the 2006 report from that commission was damning. What were its key findings regarding the state's culpability?
The report confirmed the civilian status of the recruits. It detailed the systemic abuse, the specific moment salary payments were halted, the resulting starvation, and the decades-long government cover-up.
And
crucially, the commission affirmed the family's right to compensation and demanded official acknowledgement. It laid the foundation for justice by verifying the men's original identity as state agents, not criminals.
And then finally, 5 decades later, a sense of closure began to arrive. In August of 2024, the South Korean Defense Minister Shin Won-sik announced historic plans to issue a formal official apology for the Unit 684 program.
And the significance of this apology really cannot be overstated. 53 years after the mutiny, the government is finally admitting its role in the conspiracy and the betrayal.
And the apology is scheduled to coincide with an excavation ceremony.
That's right. Aimed at recovering the remains of those 4 executed survivors who are still believed to be in those unmarked graves in the cemetery in Goyang.
This act of recovering and identifying the remains and officially apologizing, it finally restores their humanity and their place in the national history. It confirms them belatedly as soldiers who served the state, even if that state betrayed them. It's a tragic, powerful step toward reconciliation. Hashtag outro. The story of Unit 684, The Broken Sword, it's ultimately a profound tragedy of symmetry. It was created in 1968 to mirror the North Korean threat. Exactly 31 men sent to avenge 31 men. It was intended to balance this cosmic political scale.
But the unit ultimately mirrored the state's own inherent violence back upon itself. They were trained in betrayal, they lived in violence, and they were met with state violence. Their final target was the Blue House, because the Blue House, not Kim Il-sung, had become the immediate architect of their starvation, their physical abuse, and their existential fear.
So the mutiny wasn't just an act of desperation. It was a powerful, violent rejection of their disposability. They refused to be erased quietly as criminal elements.
And this really leads us to the synthesis of the entire event. Unit 684 did not fail in their training. They succeeded completely.
How do you mean?
They were trained to be fearless, decisive, and lethal instruments. And they succeeded in becoming exactly what the state paid for. The state's fatal error was assuming that such a powerful, precise weapon, forged in the crucible of isolation and fueled by profound betrayal, would ever remain docile in the hands of its maker once that maker proved treacherous.
It's an incredibly sobering lesson in the limits of state power and the cost of cynicism.
It is. And it raises a profound question for you, the listener, to contemplate. When a government makes the lack of a paper trail and the promise of plausible deniability a foundational strategy for a black operation, how does that strategy fundamentally undermine the very concept of loyalty and trust in state-sanctioned covert operations globally? Because when the state actively works to make you a ghost, it strips away the foundation of allegiance. It leaves only vengeance.
A soldier who is defined as a ghost has no loyalty left to the living. A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for diving deep with us.